Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Hi, John. How are you? How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Doug. Yeah, very well. Getting stuck into my work. It's sort of new semesters rolling around for those of us working in universities. But hey ho, I have this tactic I always do. I'm not saying that this is a good tactic, but you know when you have a big to-do list and you always think, I know what I should do is pick like, you know, the most important stuff and work on that. But there's just something a bit more motivational in there about just picking the easiest things off there and just being able to tick everything off when you've had a couple of weeks off work. But anyway, that's me. How are you, Doug?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm learning from you all the time, John. I will adopt that strategy from now on.
So some are bad habits, Doug. You don't
I
necessarily
like
always
bad
want to learn from
habits. I'm well into bad
them.
habits.
So we're heading down under again today.
We are, and it's our pleasure and our privilege to have a brilliant guest. That's Dean Mumm. And Dean will be very well known to people in the world of rugby union. For the first part of his career, Dean was an elite rugby union player, an international, a forward, who actually also captained the Wallabies. So we have the potential for an interesting discussion about the player's perspective and the captain's perspective. But he was also the captain of Exeter Chiefs, which is one of the UK's leading rugby union teams. But all athletics careers always come to an end at some stage. Some people stay in the sport, and Dean has. But Dean has also developed an alternative career. He's now head of delivery for recovery, which is described as Australia's leading occupational rehab provider. And they have a declared interest in creating better, safe working environments. And that, of course, could easily include mental toughness. So Dean does remain involved with rugby. He's a director of RUPA, the Rugby Union Players Association, as well as being involved in and forming some interesting charities, particularly a charity that's called BorneHMRI, which looks at the prevention of premature birth. So we've got a really interesting conversation coming up today. Welcome, Dean. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming down under. It's nice of you to join me, even if it's for an hour or so. But yeah, no, I'm pretty well actually. Thank you. I just come back. It's obviously winter down here, and our end is a bit different. But I was at the ski fields on the weekend, so it was a good opportunity to enjoy myself and a bit of après skiing as well. So a good weekend.
Fantastic.
Are you good skier, Dean?
Well, I'm developing. Let's put it that way. I'm not too bad. I've got a wife and her family who are excellent skiers, and I didn't ski for 18 years because I was playing professional sport basically. So and I'm tall, so I look a bit like a giraffe on skis. So it's not a natural environment, but I have been told if I don't keep up, I'll have to ski by myself. So I'm developing. There's a lot of incentive to develop quick.
Yeah. Getting down there in the end.
Yeah, so we all make it down there in some way, don't we?
Well, Dean, we've had a couple of conversations beforehand, and we know that you've got a very keen interest in the mental toughness concept. What took you to the mental toughness concept? Where does that interest come from?
I mean, a little bit. It kind of started earlier in this year. I was preparing for a keynote speech on resilience, and I haven't done a mountain of keynote speaking, but I've done a little bit here and there. Just sort of talking through a little bit through my story. And I sort of came to this conclusion quite quickly as I was sort of preparing for the speech. Most people, I think, are already pretty resilient. We've just come off the back of a pandemic when we've all been thrown to the wall with something we haven't expected for, and pretty much everyone got through, and I appreciate the incidences of mental illness and other things have increased, but everyone by largely is still here. And previously, both through my work and sort of again through my circumstance, I was kind of aware of this concept of post-traumatic growth, as in, so the ability to look back and think, well, I'm actually better in some way than what I was before I went through whatever the trauma was. And I think a lot of us maybe can reflect on the pandemic and think, well, there is elements of me now that I'm more aware of and more comfortable with than I was beforehand. And sort of as I've started researching those sort of two concepts to get a bit of a more of a academic framework around resilience, I came across mental toughness as a concept, and in particular some of the work that you guys and your respective teams had done. And it was a really lovely framework. I actually pretty much built this whole speech around mental toughness, but more operating with mental toughness rather than just looking at it in isolation. And so, yeah, that's how I sort of came to it. And it's definitely resonated with me, both from the sporting context, which I think we'll delve into a bit today, but also some of the traumatic events that I've sort of been through in my life, and as you look back on them, often it's easiest for most easiest as humans to understand things within a framework, isn't it? And this was a nice little framework for me to reflect on some of the things I'd been through.
In terms of then the post-traumatic growth, because it's an area that is it's inherently linked to mental toughness, of course, but I don't think we've ever explicitly tried to connect the two areas. How do you see those, our mental toughness framework connecting with sort of post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of it is the ability to understand that often when you go through a tough period in life, it can be a tough session in sport, what you sort of learn after you've been through a few tough sessions, let's use a sporting context, is you realize that there's always a tougher one coming. Like you think, geez, that was hard session, and you put it on your RPE that it's a 10 out of 10, and your obviously physical exertion's well out there, and then you're like, you know what, another one's coming. But the more you've been through of those sessions, the more you realize, you know what, you're going to get through that. And this one is hard and it's horrible, but you know what, like I'm probably going to be better for it, and I probably understand that it's worthwhile in the long run. But you don't have that visibility over events in your life, do you really? And you rarely do you sit in the middle of them and go, I'm going to get through this. I know I'll be fine. I know I'll get through this. And actually, you know what? I'll probably look back at this through whatever it is, and I'll probably realize that there is something about me that will be better because of this. So I suppose my frame of looking at it is always connecting that that control, maybe in that area of when you're going through something that's difficult, having that ability to go, you know what, I've got it. I will get through it. And I know that actually at the back end, there'll be something that I can tie back to this event, whatever it is, whatever this session, whatever's going on, that I can look at, and I can look at more positively about myself. And so that's the sort of connection to it. Now, like there's going to be clearly not a researcher into this, but it's like, it's almost the understanding that you can grow as a result of what you're going through allows you to almost, I'm not going to say enjoy, but certainly be a lot more controlled in that moment, whatever that is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, it's interesting as you talk there, Dean, kind of, you go to the sports analogy first, and in a sense, I think this is one of the real values in sports psychology, and this is actually why we seem to speak to so many people who started in sport, in that this kind of physical action of, you know, training and playing sport is a sort of a more, it's an easier analogy to get your head round, to then try and apply it to the shades of grey that we have about, you know, everything else we do in our life. But certainly that sense of, you can think about in sport, you take on a new challenge, like you say, you do something, they ask you what your RPE is, your rating of perceived exertion, you get, you know, like a 15-point or 19-point chart, where are you? You think, geez, I'm at the top. And so you're saying there that you get this belief that, okay, I can't do this yet, but because I know physically I've gone through things where, well, that happens every time I try something new, right? So then you start approaching new things as a, well, whatever I can't do now, that's fine. I'll just appreciate that and get there. Is that kind of a fair assessment of how maybe sport translates into other areas?
Yeah, I mean, the poor people that are in my team at work just get absolutely jack of sporting analogies, because that's the way my brain works as well. You know, like it's, and whatever it is, I'll talk to sport first. But also, the beauty of sport as an analogy is that people get it. You know, in the UK and Australia and probably in the US, where sports weaved into the fabric of our societies, you know, it's people follow a team, so you get inherent peaks and troughs into what are you doing anyway. And you know, like, you don't think you're going to learn a lot from a season when you win 2 games, but you do. And you know, does it have to affect the year that comes after? Not really. You know, like I was in a team where we lost all but 2 games. We won the first game of the season, the last game of the season. It was my first year in the Waratahs, and the next year we made the final. You know, so what's the difference between those two? I mean, probably, John, it's probably why you're in sports psychology trying to work that out. But it's like, it's also, you know, did you work any harder, or what are the factors that run through it? But inherently, people have experienced that as well, because people play amateur sport, or they play junior sport, or they follow a team and they get it. And also, you know, like, and one of my frustrations, I suppose, as well, is we don't think about mental illness in that context sometimes. You know, whereas, you know, if I do a grade 1 hammy and I seek appropriate treatment, I rest, I move away from the situation, I get, you know, appropriate treatment from someone that is a professional, the likelihood is that grade 1 is going to be 2 to 3 weeks. You know, if I keep running on it, I keep smashing myself, I keep really putting myself under pressure and putting myself in situations that propose that to risk, that's going to go to a grade 2 and a grade 3, and the recovery's longer. You know, so it's a much easier analogy to understand than, oh, I feel pretty shit today. Yeah. So anyway, it's just easy to understand, basically.
Yeah, I can see all those analogies coming out for the team all the time. But no,
poor buggers.
but you're so right. We just kind of like another thing I often say to them when I'm talking to people is, it's like, I think it's my job to try and push people. Like, it's not just to sort of sit there and go, "Ah, you poor sod," like, you know. So I'll often say, well, when your strength and conditioning coach does a session with you expect to come out of it feeling a little bit sore. You know, you've been pushed a little bit outside of your comfort zone. You're not going to be bruised. You're not going to be, you know, laid up for days. And again, that would be a similar sort of analogy that I regularly kind of use from a mental point of view. That's what we need to try and do to people as well. We should be pushing you slightly outside your comfort zone, making you, you know, experiencing those small traumas with good support around it, and to enable that growth. Because that's again, I'm going to go in a sports analogy overload if I don't stop myself. Essentially, that's what you're doing with that's what you're doing with resistance training, isn't it? You're putting your muscle fibers just through a small amount of trauma each time, but the right amount, you know, and then you're giving it appropriate recovery. And That's how we
Yeah,
grow.
I was thinking the identical analogy, if that helps. The tearing of the microfibers to get a stronger muscle, So anyway, Doug, maybe you could steer us away from this.
Well, no, I'm quite happy with this because I think one of the refreshing things about looking at sport is I don't think people realise just how much adversity there is in sport. If you go and support a team, you kind of sweep aside any defeats and you concentrate on the wins. But actually, if you look at any athlete in almost any environment, they are experiencing a lot of adversity, but they often don't, you don't see it from outside. And I think that's one of the things that sport can bring to everybody else. You must have been, if you played at the top level, you must have experienced lots of lousy moments in your career, and yet you're still smiling. So, maybe you can tell us about a particular moment in your life when you thought, right, this was the worst moment in your life, and then what happened?
Yeah, ironically, I was talking to some of the guys from Rupert today. There's been plenty of lousy moments in life, but from a sporting team, I was reflecting on actually the first 2 years that I played for the Wallabies. So I played the Wallabies in 2 stints. So I played 2008 to 2011, didn't make the World Cup, and then played 2015, 16. So, and then made the 2015 World Cup. So I had at least a period of 4 years out in between. But I was sort of reflecting that 2009 was probably in the Wallaby setup was when I look back, and it's probably one of the least happiest I've been playing. And I don't know why. I mean, it was sort of, there was a few cultural elements in there, I think. Not to say the culture was poor, because we were still performing. That stage the Wallabies were number 2 in the world, and pretty much the only team we couldn't beat was the All Blacks, but no one else could beat them, so we weren't too bad. But we could beat pretty much anywhere else. But it sort of reflects on the fact that there was elements there where maybe I hadn't really. It all happened quite quickly too. So I came in and had played Super Rugby, and we'd made this final early on, and then picked in the Wallabies, and then you just move on. And did it happen too easy, or was it I was not entirely grateful, but then my body was pretty broken as well. Like, was never bad enough to miss a match, but never good enough to perform extremely well. So there was that intersection. It was really fascinating that in that period, I'd go back and play club rugby, which is sort of, in Australia, there's 3 tiers of rugby. And so I would play for my local club, Sydney University. And I'd need that as a breath of fresh air from playing from professional sport, playing for my country. And it was really fascinating dynamic when you look back at that and say, why wasn't that the pinnacle? It was the pinnacle. You're playing for your country. But the enjoyment wasn't there, Whereas later in my career, the second time I played for Wallabies, every moment mattered. And every moment I loved it. And, but through that period of that middle year where I'd missed out, those middle couple of years, I'd been away. I'd seen the Wallabies from a different perspective. I'd seen them as an international team rather than a team in Australia that you see. You understood what it was like to miss it. You've been dropped from that team. And I'd also been through some personal trauma, like we'd lost a couple of children to preterm birth. And so it was a huge development of my own sense of identity away from being a rugby player. And so from all of that became this sense of, well, what have I got to lose? And so you had to really roll the dice. I had to personally really roll the dice to get there. I had to come home. I had to get myself out of my contract in Exeter. And I basically had already told Rob Baxter I was going to retire before I came home. I thought, well, I got nothing else to lose. Why not go for it? And every moment from that point on was bloody amazing. So that is an example of, I suppose, the ebbs and flows and journey of professional sport. But I don't know if that relates perfectly to your question, Doug, but that's my answer, So.
Well, no, that's fine. I mean, what would intrigue me, and obviously intrigues John, is what is it? What changed inside your head that enabled you to be, well, as Peter Clough says, so comfortable in your own skin?
To be fair, I think it was the exposure to like personal loss, really, as being a really defining feature of that period. And the interesting thing about, so we're in 3 separate lots. We lost Sophie, our first child, and then our son Henry was born and died 9 days later of an infection, and then my twins were born a couple of years after that. But each one of those events was actually subsequently almost more traumatic than the previous ones.
Yeah.
But every one of them was slightly easier to deal with because you knew you'd already been through it. So it was this really interesting dynamic of and when I played for the Wallabies, we were sort of in between the second and third incident of what happened.
Right.
And so I'd actually really had to dig quite deep to sort of get my head around that and understand about who I was, what my motivator was, the why behind my operating, why I operated, and I came back very confident in what that was and how to apply that. And it's vastly different now. I mean, you can apply that to whatever trade or practice might be in front of you, and rugby happened to be, that sense of it, and there was a confidence in that, and there was a control that whatever that was going to get thrown at me probably was not going to be any worse than I've been through, and I was pretty confident I'd roll through it. To use the 4 C's as a sort of framework to explore that a little bit, that's kind of where I felt like I was like, yep, nothing to lose. I know I'll get through it, and if it gets through, it can't be any worse than I've been through. So, and I'll roll on and find a job.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense at several levels. I don't know what John thinks, but what I think you're describing is a degree of learning orientation. It's one of the factors in the mental toughness concept. And some of us are capable of looking at adversity and things that happen to us and learn from that and learn how to deal with it more effectively next time. I think that's what you're describing. And of course, we know that if we step back and look at the mental toughness concept, part of it is genetic, but part of it is experiential. So some of us develop our mental toughness through our life's experiences, but some of us have got that capability. Not everyone has that capability. So I think you've probably been describing something like that. Would you agree, John?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. And I just interested in so when you've got these two very different reasons, and probably very different kind of impact on the why that you mentioned there. But these two stresses going on, this kind of immense trauma and grief in a personal life, and then the stress of high performance sport. How did you find trying to sort of compartmentalize them in a sense? Did you carry them? I know obviously they were happening at the same time in sort of real time, but in terms of you being in them, did you feel that you sort of experienced the stresses together, or were you able to sort of kind of close one of the boxes and focus on the other?
Yeah, I don't know. There's a little bit of get on with it, which maybe is, it's one of the things I think that probably comes out in the M2Q for me is you just move on, and like maybe I look back at it, maybe there's this concept I haven't really fully dealt with some of the trauma from it. But you also just, the beauty of sport in amateur or professional sport is you just move on to next week, and you do a reflection. And again, like this comes out in the question, I'm not a super reflective person. I'd rather part of the reason I can never be a coach is because I really don't like watching footage. And so, like I reflect very quickly and say, oh, okay, that's what I can do, or that's what I can improve upon. And then I'll move forward and get on with next week. And if I'd like to sort of, rugby sense, I'd like to have my review wrapped up by sort of midday Monday if you played on Saturday, and then we crack on with next week from that. So you actually, the way the training or the way I was trained was to, wrap that up, quick review, let's crack on. Now, maybe I think there's holes in that, and I think I could definitely been more supportive to people around me as a result. But you just get on with it, don't you? I mean, that was maybe my way of surviving. But in a way as well, rugby became play again rather than a job. And I think the whole Exeter experience for me was about searching for that. I'd sort of been in, as I said, in that environment where it was for a period of it, I was unhappy and detrained, and all those things were inherently in there. But then I had a big chunk of time to train up to go to Exeter. And then one of the reasons I spoke to Rod Baxter, and he's like, well, yes, and that was the second year that the Chiefs had been up in the premiership. And he's like, well, we've probably achieved better than we have. But we generally we have a lot of fun. And I was like, yeah, great. I'm bang up for that. And it was, and hopefully remains a club that they do have a lot of fun. And you can generally see that from the outside in teams and cultures, I think. But and so you embrace this play again of sport, rather than being professional sporters. So I get to play rugby, and there's not nearly as much travel as I used to do. And I was at home a lot more. And so there was that, but in no means am I saying I dealt with it perfectly well. I'm just saying that's how I dealt with it. And but to be fair, it was bloody hard at home too, because we were away from home without a support mechanism around us and trying to get through it. And it was by no means sunny every day,
Yeah, absolutely.
It was not sunny every day because it's in the UK. So
that's the sunniest bit of the UK, though.
That's right. Yeah, the British Riviera. It's beautiful down there.
I wonder then, Dean, because you captained when you were in Exeter, is that right?
Yeah.
So did that? What kind of attributes do you think you brought to that? Was that sense of always being forward-looking, useful when you're leading, rather than necessarily being the one who's sort of wanting to watch clips until Wednesday afternoon?
I think there's value in both, to be fair, but I do think it's helpful to. Rugby is a sport where, certainly in my experience, the best leaders have often been those that lead from the front. And maybe leading from the front is that ability to then say, okay, whatever, we're off, and we've got to let's deal with this. Let's do our review, but let's not sit on this for too long, because there's another team coming this week and another set of strategies and another application of whatever we need to do. And by the time you go and you're on that field on Monday afternoon, we should be starting to move forward with that. And I think I generally, particularly in sport, I'm an optimist. I think that unless you're down by 30 with about 15 to go, you can generally find a way through. And I think there's a value in being an optimist, and a value in always thinking there's a way to win. And reality is the vast majority of times, but I would say 90%, even though some of those seasons that are really, that I've been through where we haven't won many, I'd say 90% of the games I've ever played in, there was strong belief that we could win that game. At the top of the season, when you're getting dusted plenty of times, and you're playing the best team, you're like, I still reckon we can win, but we're going to need a few things to go our way. But you've got to. So I think from a captain's point of view, I think it is valuable to be an optimist, and value to be able to see, and a value to be able, from a pure rugby sense, the value in think of sevens is key numbers throughout. So if I'm down by 15. What do I get to do to get within 7? Because then the pressure switches back to the opposition rather than on us. And there's value in thinking about, and any of those measures are very helpful to sort of almost compartmentalize where you are in that context in that period of the game. But the reality is, the longer you play, you realize that the weekend is, and the weekend performance is only a facet of the decisions made across the course of the whole week. You know,
Yeah.
So in efforts that I've always done with sports psychs, and they're always like, well, you know, it's almost that, you tell us about your best game. You're like, yeah, right. And then we're like, well, what did you do that week? And how did you feel? And, you know, then start to build out that full package of what that performance looked like, not what I did 15 carries and I tackled twice and I scored a try. You know, it's like, what are the decisions that happen across the course of that week that led to high performance? You know, or what are the decisions across a series of weeks that led us to win 3 games or lose 3? And, you know, that's a more interesting play. And certainly as you get older or you're more experienced, that's the sort of, for me, that was the frame that if my performance was off, I'd had to look at the decisions I'd made and the building and the growth that would come from that. And it's, and I think, you know, or equally as a captain looking at a team, that's probably the way that you should start to look at it, rather than we lost by 3. Did we lose that on Monday, or did we lose it? Yeah, when did we lose that?
Yeah. No, I think that's really valuable. So what I'm hearing there is quite a few things that kind of talk to, you know, control, and in a sense, like looking forward. Obviously, you have much more control over that when you talk about these kind of key performance indicators, how many carries, how many tackles, those kind of things. But actually, it's that process of, but what did you do? Like, how did you get there? What was your mindset? That rather than the measurable stuff. And the other thing I thought was really interesting there, Dean, was that the focus on optimism, because we know that optimism is positively associated with mental toughness, and I think that's in a few ways, and certainly in terms of control and stuff. But to me, that's kind of where you're drawing confidence from, is not confidence that's based on what's happened. Because how do you remain confident when you've won 1 game all season, right? Yet you know you have to, because confidence is really important. And I think what you're describing really well there is you're drawing that confidence on what you believe you can do next week, not drawing on what's already happened. And I always think that's it's so interesting when you hear pundits and commentators talk about a confidence boosting win, a confidence knocking defeat. You think, well, if my confidence is contingent upon things, you know, that happen to me, it's not really self-confidence, is it? Like that's what pundits and the like are paid to do. Whereas your confidence there is drawn on my belief on what can happen in the future and how I can control that. And I think that's sort of a really kind of powerful mechanism there for being able to adopt that really positive mindset going forward.